You're listening to Bits by Harry Suez. Hello, welcome. Today, let's talk about a subject I came across on Instagram. Let's talk the myth of the literary patriarchy and the new misandrist clichés. This notion has gained significant traction. The idea that the classical literary canon is nothing more than a monolithic tool of patriarchal power. Well, let me be blunt. I say this reading is a simplistic myth. Not only does it ignore the complexity, even the deep negativity, of the male characters who inhabit these foundational works, but it also inadvertently helps obscure a more insidious, opposite problem that's infecting much of contemporary literature. And that's exactly what I intend to call out, with my usual dose of bad faith. But just because the sign is bigger than it needs to be, doesn't mean it's pointing in the wrong direction. Literature has never truly been an agent of patriarchy. In fact, I'd argue that today, it's becoming a vehicle for what I'd call femino-gender supremacist illogic. A growing trend in literature, often under the banner of feminist critique, is falling into the trap of oversimplification and promoting misandrist biases. Let's be clear, this is not about attacking all feminist literature, but about pointing out a recurring phenomenon: the negative caricaturing of men that replicates stereotypical mechanisms to push a shallow, misleading narrative. We need to say no and break this cycle of reductive representations. It's time to identify the real barriers to literature's genuine liberation from this sterile gender war. That means naming the myths and lies embedded both in the anachronistic readings of the past and the emerging clichés of the present. To break free, we'll begin by deconstructing the myth of the patriarchal canon, then take a hard look at these new stereotypes, examine the motivations behind them and their damaging consequences, and ultimately make a case for a much-needed return to the individual. The idea of the classical literary canon as some kind of imaginary patriarchy collapses the moment you actually open the books. Yes, these works emerged from male-dominated societies with clearly defined gender roles. But that's precisely the point. Great literature has excelled at exposing the cracks, contradictions, and darkness of the human condition, including the masculine one. The canon is a spectacular gallery of male anti-heroes. Forget flawless knights in shining armor. Think instead of Don Quixote's pathetic idealism, Charles Bovary's pitiful mediocrity, Julian Sorel's cynical ambition, Raskolnikov's neurotic guilt, Hamlet's paralyzing indecision. These men are weak, ridiculous, tragic, monstrous. Far from glorifying them, literature has always been a machine for deconstructing the masculine ideal more than celebrating it. The so-called male fraternity within these works, it's a farce. What dominates instead is rivalry, isolation, cutthroat competition. Male power? Far from being exalted, it's portrayed as corrupting, unstable, leading to downfall, think Shakespeare's kings, or smug mediocrity, Balzac's bourgeois men. Often, men are the first victims of the very norms of masculinity they're supposed to embody. Granted, we must distinguish the complexity of great literature from the clichés sometimes found in older popular genres. But reducing the canon to those stereotypes is a fundamental analytical error. Let's not forget the presence of strong, complex female characters: Antigone, Elizabeth Bennet, Madame de Merteuil, Emma Bovary, Anna Karenina, who show that even in constrained contexts, literature has long explored a wide range of human experience, far from any uniformly misogynistic worldview. Recognizing that richness is the first step toward moving beyond simplistic ideological readings. If the canon is more nuanced than it's made out to be, then today's literary landscape shows the opposite and worrying trend: a caricatured simplification of male characters in some influential circles. We don't need to generalize wildly to see that this phenomenon is widespread enough to deserve scrutiny. The works in question are often those that, under the guise of a female perspective or a legitimate critique of patriarchy, adopt the conventions of what could be called a media-driven feminism, one that's sometimes reductive. The socially necessary shockwave of the hashtag #MeToo has at times led to narrative patterns where the man is predefined as the antagonist. The result? Repetitive, tiresome male stereotypes. The oppressor, conscious or not. The selfish partner. The man incapable of empathy. The predator. The absentee father. These flat characters serve only to illustrate a thesis embodying toxic masculinity without depth or nuance. And in reverse, women are often confined to the equally reductive, though seemingly empowering role of the strong, virtuous survivor, which erases their own complexities. Let's call a spade a spade. This consistently negative, oversimplified portrayal of men stems from a misandrist bias. And unlike classical literature, which was neither misogynistic nor progressive, but rather a mirror of its time, today's trend reflects a harmful mode of thinking, reducing individuals to their gender and assigning them flaws by default. It's the same binary, essentialist logic as the patriarchy it claims to fight. The paradox is a cruel one. In the name of fighting stereotypes, we create new ones. We commit the very fault we claim to oppose. It's a betrayal of the ideal of complex, non-essentialist representation of human beings. Why such a stark difference between the nuanced complexity of the literary canon and the flattening of certain contemporary narratives? Context and intention offer revealing, if unsettling, answers. Classical authors, though shaped by the biases of their times, were not usually writing to defend the male gender. Their purpose lay elsewhere, to explore the human soul, society, fate. Their blind spots were largely unconscious, reflections of their era. You could say they had nothing to defend because they weren't under threat. Today, the context is radically different. Literature exists in a flood of activist rhetoric, moral imperatives, and intense social and media pressure. Writers are strongly encouraged to choose a side, to craft stories that align with a particular ideological message. In this environment, it's hard to dismiss the idea that today's negative male stereotypes are less accidental than intentional. Simplification becomes a tool. It drives home a message, illustrates a thesis, gives voice to anger. It also feeds a new cliché: the woman as a radiant being who has survived the worst, surrounded by incompetent, selfish, or foolish men. But she is stronger, wounded yet alive, beautiful and empathetic, yet also an artist, a cook, a mother, and a well of deep inner strength. Political or didactic goals begin to overshadow artistic freedom. Literature becomes a means of advocacy or propaganda rather than a space for nuanced exploration. This evolution raises a fundamental question about the autonomy of art in the face of dominant ideologies. This trend toward gendered simplification isn't merely a matter of taste. It has real consequences, both literary and social. In literary terms, it's a radical impoverishment. Nuance, complexity, ambiguity, the hallmarks of great literature are replaced by black and white moralizing. Characters become flat, predictable, incapable of inspiring genuine empathy or deep reflection. We lose literature's ability to surprise us, to unsettle us, to explore the gray areas of human experience. Socially, it's disastrous. Instead of building bridges, this kind of literature digs deeper trenches in the gender war. By demonizing the other side, it fuels resentment, legitimizes reactionary backlash, a fertile breeding ground for masculinist ideologies, and makes dialogue impossible. It betrays fiction's true calling, to foster empathy. Worse still, it undermines the very causes it claims to champion. Even a valid social critique loses credibility when it relies on crude caricatures. Attention is diverted from real systemic issues to biased portrayals. Simplification, far from being an effective tool, is counterproductive. Faced with this dead end, only one path seems possible and necessary: a wholehearted return to the individual. Literature must urgently refocus on the uniqueness and complexity of human beings, beyond gender-based assignments. The artist always has a choice: to create flag bearers for a cause or to explore singular destinies. Individualization is the antidote to stereotypes. Let's create characters with strength, yes, but also contradictions, personal histories, the ability to surprise us. Gender shapes experience, but it should never define a character nor reduce them to a type. It is one facet among many. The goal is to show how norms affect unique individuals, not to use individuals as illustrations of those norms. It's through this exploration of the individual that literature achieves the universal and stirs empathy. The complexity of a Raskolnikov or a Scarlett O'Hara teaches us far more about humanity than any one-dimensional figure ever could. This spirit of individualization, for all its limitations, already animated much of the canon. The point is not to go backward, but to return to that fundamental ambition, to explore the human being in all their richness and wretchedness. Let's recap the argument. The myth of a purely patriarchal canon is a gross oversimplification. A part of today's literature falls into the opposite trap, spreading misandrist biases through caricature, sometimes intentionally, with damaging consequences. The only way forward is a return to the individual. This demand for individualization brings us back, not to the letter but to the spirit, of the best literature of the past. The kind that, despite its flaws, sought to understand the singular human before judging them or recruiting them for a cause. Let's stop the anachronistic readings and lazy indictments of the past, and let's be equally uncompromising about the simplifications of the present. From either direction, the final call is clear. Let's put an end to this sterile gender war in literature. Let's demand shared complexity for men and women alike. Let's reject caricature no matter where it comes from. Only by embracing the contradictory richness of the human condition can literature once again become a bridge, a space for dialogue and empathy, and finally contribute to the true flourishing of a social individualism. That was today's bit. See you in the next one.